Hello, my friends. We've got such an eventful diary entry today, and some photographs, and some introductions. So Dimitri is writing at some length for the first time that I've encountered about the situation with his father and stepmother and his feelings about that. He's being quite honest. And what has brought this on is the fact that two people apparently who either were attached to Paul, or if not attached to him, Paul being Dimitri's father, then had been visiting him in Paris. And Dimitri abbreviates their names. So one of them he abbreviates as Emel, I-M-E-L, period, and then gives a patronymic Pavel. So I'm assuming this was a man, so it would be Pavlovich. But I could be wrong, because I really don't know what the name, what Emel would be short for. I don't believe I've ever encountered that name. Emelian, maybe? I don't know. So it would probably be, Emelian Pavlovich, and then we have one that's easy to decipher, relatively easy, because Dimitri, when he mentions it the second time, uses the full patronymic. So it's Alex, as an abbreviation, Alex Fyodorovich. And the likelihood is that it would be Alexander, but it could also be Alexei. So I'm going to leave it Alex Fyodorovich. And I bring them up in advance because you will hear their names, and you know in advance that I don't know who they were. All right, so let's dive into it. This is the 17th March, 1906, and Dimitri erroneously identifies it as a Thursday. He'd already identified the 16th of March as a Thursday, so this was actually a Friday, and you'll see that he refers to the weekend being the next day and the day after, so it was definitely the Friday. All right, what a shame, really. Tomorrow and Sunday there are dinners, so I'll have to stay at home. It's a terrible pity, because those are the only 2 days when I'm able to have dinner. Tomorrow I'll have to dine alone with Miss June. Oh, what a bore. GM is going to town to visit his cousin from Kiev. On Sunday, lunch will be formal, which will be a bore. I'm very sorry that those 2 days will be wasted. Tomorrow is that lousy Betak. I haven't done my assignments from him. After all, I was sick, and I'll tell him that. This afternoon, Emel Pavlovich and Alex Fyodorovich came to see us. It was great fun to see him in his colonel's shoulder boards. He had a lot to tell about Papa's life in Paris, and, thank God, didn't say anything about her. He talked about the house Papa bought. While he was telling us about it, I was thinking that Papa isn't planning on coming home to Russia if he's gone so far as to buy a house, 2 cars, etc. I had thought that after the sovereign gave him permission, he would come more often, but he's only been here twice. She's probably holding him back. Damn her, she's such a nasty beast. Incidentally, when we went to town before my influenza to see Wilson, while Maria was being worked on, we went to an exhibition and ran into Pistolkors. And then, when we were leaving, we ran into his son, a horse guards officer, on horseback. We have amazing luck with those Pistolkors birds. I showed Alex Fyodorovich my kittens, which he liked. Today I went to tea for the first time with Aunt Alex and Uncle Nicky. The conversation wasn't anything special. The children haven't gotten better over time. They're still disobedient. They yell, scream, and squeak, and they're rude. Phew, my head is hurting again. These days, Maria Nikolaevna looks at me askance, but God bless her. I need to go to bed. 9:45. All right. Very interesting stuff. So when he refers to the only 2 days when I'm able to have dinner, I think it's because he means that he only has dinner at the Alexander Palace on weekends, because otherwise he has lessons during the week. So anyway, I haven't gone back to look at to see if every time he mentions having dinner at the Alexander Palace it's a weekend or not, but I'm assuming that's what he means. And because GM is going to town, this is a nightmare weekend for poor Dimitri, because he's going to have dinner alone with his favorite person, Miss June. Maria is going to these regimental dinners, and when Dimitri says GM is going to town, he means that GM is going to St. Petersburg. All right, and Dimitri is also unhappy that lunch on Sunday will be some kind of formal event, and I'm sure he'll be going to that. He won't be going to the dinner, but he'll be going to lunch. So as far as he's concerned, it's a wasted weekend, and then he also has a lesson on Saturday with that lousy Betag, so his German teacher, and he hasn't done his homework. And hopefully Betag will cut him a little slack because he's been sick, although it's been a couple days, so he could have gotten his homework done. I gather that German was not a favorite topic of his, because he tends to be pretty good about doing his homework. So now these two men turn up, and clearly there's more of a connection with Alexander Fyodorovich, because after mentioning that they both came, Dimitri then starts using the singular pronoun he, and that seems to be Alexander. All right, and when he refers to shoulder boards, I didn't use the word epaulettes. I think there's a difference. I could be wrong. The shoulder boards were the flat ones, the hard flat ones, rather than something sewn onto the uniform itself. They were changeable. You could take them off and put them on. And so I've heard the shoulder boards were a big deal. And in fact, if somebody so much as touched your shoulder boards, you could challenge them to a duel. Well, I mean, it wasn't legal to challenge people to a duel, but also during, after the revolution, when officers and male members of the imperial family had to remove their shoulder boards, that was a big deal. All right, so now we come to the subject of Papa. So Papa was Grand Duke Pavel Alexandrovich. He was the son of the Emperor Alexander II, and you will find an entry on him in David Chavchavadz's book, The Grand Dukes, and also an entry on him that I co-wrote in this book, The Grand Dukes, Volume 1, by, I think it's, Eurohistory.com. And so I co-wrote the chapter on Paul and the chapter on Grand Duke Georgy Mikhailovich, David's grandfather, with Lisa May Davidson. Some of you know her or have heard of her. And yeah, it's if you can find it, it's worth having a look at. This volume does not have Dimitri in it, and oddly enough, I did not write the chapter on Dimitri because I came into the project rather late, and that chapter had already been written by a Canadian historian named Grant Menzies, who since that time, I believe, has moved his focus away from the Romanovs. All right, and now we have, most importantly, this book by the late French historian André Ferrand, and it is about Grand Duke Paul, and it is a brilliant reference book and full of wonderful photographs, many of which came from Grand Duke Paul's grandson. What was his name? Mikhail Fyodorovich? Good Lord, I can't remember. Anyway, a lot of the photographs came from him, and so Grand Duke Paul with his second wife had a boy and 2 girls, and this was his grandson from one of the daughters. All right, and it has these great photos. So here's one of Dimitri and his sister with their father. This was probably taken in Paris. And this is, what year is this? This one is later, 1912. So this is 6 years after the diary entries that we're reading. And then we have the house that Dimitri refers to that Paul has apparently just purchased or just finalized the purchase is this one. And Ed Hansen and I have gone to see it in Paris. And it's quite an impressive place. And I believe it's now a girls' school. When we were there, we weren't able to go inside, but there were kids out playing in the playground and getting ready to leave. I think school had just gotten out. And that seems like a good thing for it to be. None of Paul's children or his widow lived in that house after the revolution. I'm not sure why. Dimitri did go to it. It was up for sale, and he did go to show some people around who were thinking of buying it. But it was a very, very bad experience for him. It kind of threw him into a depression because it was so bittersweet to see that. And now we have 2 other pictures that I would like to show that I love. This is Grand Duke Paul with his children by Olga Pistolkors and his stepchildren. And so one of these stepchildren is mentioned in this diary entry, and that is Alexander, the son of Eric. Good Lord, where would this stress be on that? Erikovich. So his father was named Eric, and he is the young horse guards officer that Dimitri refers to seeing. Okay. And then there's this other very nice photo of Paul's children and stepchildren. So Dimitri's and Maria's half-brother, Vladimir, and the 2 little girls, Natalia and Irina, and then the stepchildren. I think maybe there were more stepchildren, but that's Alexander, and what was his sister's name? I have to look. Olga. And of all of them, the one who appears most frequently in Dimitri's diaries after the revolution is Olga, and there was another one named Marianne, and Dimitri did have relationships with his stepsisters, but not with his brothers. And while they were little, he didn't really have relationship with his stepsisters. His brother, of course, his half-sisters, his half-brother, unfortunately, didn't survive the revolution. And I don't think Dimitri ever, unfortunately, took an interest in his little brother. Maria did. She talks about him in her memoirs, but Dimitri simply never mentions him, except in passing when he's killed by the Bolsheviks. Okay, so what about this relationship? So this sort of thing, this picture, these were taken in 1911, and this would have been a real slap in the face to Dimitri with his attitude at that time. And I remember in Maria's memoirs, I believe, she mentions that that she and Dimitri knew about this other family that Paul had was when they saw a picture of their half-brother on Paul's desk and didn't know who he was. And of course, we're curious to know who this little boy was and why there was a photograph of him on their father's desk in his study. So Paul and Olga married in 1902, and her maiden name was Karnovich, and she was married at that time to an officer who's mentioned in today's diary entry. Can I find a picture of him? His name was Eric von Pistolkors, obviously a Russified German or Scandinavian or Baltic family. I'm not sure which. I'm sorry. I thought there was a picture of him, but I'm going to stop looking for it. Okay. And so, this is nice though. Here's a picture of Paul with his two little girls. So they got married in 1902. It was not only a morganatic marriage, but she was a divorcee. So Paul was a widower. There was no problem with that. But she divorced her husband to marry him. I believe she'd been somehow attached to, or her husband had, to the household of Grand Duke Vladimir, Paul's older brother. And once they got married in 1902, of course, it completely disrupted Dimitri and Maria's life. They had not spent a lot of time with their father. They'd seen him every day briefly, but still, it completely disrupted their life. They went to live with their uncle and aunt in Moscow. They had been living in St. Petersburg. Their uncle and aunt's household was, as I've mentioned before, when we talked about Grand Duke Sergei, was rather problematic. And yeah, it was certainly a traumatic thing for them. And I think Ella wrote at one time that when Paul came to visit after he left, or even while he was there, Dimitri cried all the time and didn't really want to have that much to do with his father and was kind of clinging to her. But I need to review that. That is from the upcoming biography of Dimitri, and I need to take another look at that. So the ironic thing really is that Paul had a similar experience. He had been older than Dimitri. He hadn't been, 10 or 11 years old. He was already a young man. But his father, Alexander II, had done the same thing. Basically, he had, in a more morally debatable way, to say the least, because Alexander was not a widower. He had a wife, and his wife was dying of tuberculosis, and the wife was particularly close to her two youngest children, Grand Duke Sergei and Grand Duke Paul, and they were loyal to her. And their father had a mistress whom he had moved into the palace, into the Winter Palace, and he'd had children with her, out of wedlock children, and he was devoted to her and to her children at the same time that his wife, who was also living in the palace, was dying of tuberculosis, and her two youngest sons were loyal to her, and what their father was doing hurt them very, very much. And in fact, she had been the one who had owned Ilinskaya and had passed it on to her to her son Sergei. And so I remember reading about, trying to remember the source. Was it Grand Duke Constantine's diaries? I can't remember, but I remember reading about how distraught Paul was after his mother died, that his father, the emperor, didn't waste any time at all and immediately married his mistress and started talking about making his son a Grand Duke and so on and so forth. And Paul and his brother were devastated by that, even though they were young adults at that time. And here he is doing the same thing to his children, although, you could say in a more sympathetic way. But on the other hand, they must have felt abandoned, and they knew that their father was living with his new family, and that he was, having his photo taken in a family group with his stepchildren, So yeah, that must have been hard. And of course they blamed her. Uh, you know, it was, I'm sure, I'm sure it was as much Papa as it was their stepmother. After all, he knew what he was doing, and he was the one who decided to walk away from his children, knowing that that would be the case and that he would be banished by the Tsar. Maybe he'd hoped that the Tsar would let him have custody of his children, but that wasn't the case, and it was probably always unlikely because being a little Grand Duke and Grand Duchess, it would have it would have been considered important, especially in Dimitri's case, that he be raised in Russia and not in France. So, Nicholas started lifting the ban a little bit. And by this time, in 1906, Paul is allowed to come and go from Russia. I'm not sure if he was allowed to bring Olga with him as yet. By 1908, he would be. And then by 1912, I believe they would both be given permission to come back and live in Russia as man and wife. But they didn't come back until 1914 when the war started, and they rushed back to Russia to help out in any way they could. So Dimitri is disappointed. His feelings are probably hurt because he knows that his father can come back to Russia for visits, but he isn't. He's been there twice. We don't know in what time frame. And not only that, but he's bought a house in Paris, and he's bought cars, and he's obviously settling down. And so he is not going to be coming back to Russia to live, and he's not going to be coming back frequently even to visit his children. So yeah, that's kind of upsetting. And of course the person he lashes out at is his stepmother, and he calls her a nasty beast, and he will continue to be disparaging about her in the letter in the pre-World War I letters that he writes to his sister while she's still married. But that will change. That will start to shift, so that before the Russian Revolution, when it's still during the First World War, he's already started calling her Mamachka, so which is kind of like mommy or little mama. And yeah, he's warmed up to her, and after the revolution, even more so. Both he and Maria start spending time with her and start appreciating her, and also their little sisters. And Dimitri is quite touched at one point when his little sisters give him gifts for Christmas, and he hasn't gotten them anything, so he's embarrassed by that. And he called them the bibichki, the babies, which is maybe what his father had called them as well. I don't know. So, all this is very interesting, and we'll keep an eye on this situation and see how that develops, and maybe we can pinpoint when it was that he started to thaw toward her. And he was always looking for mother figures anyway, so, why not? He's got a stepmother, he's got his mamachka. Okay, so Wilson. When Wilson was mentioned previously, you may remember I used the name Wallison, and Dimitri very often, when he's confronted with a non-Russian name, simply transliterates it into the Cyrillic alphabet phonetically. And apparently he was hearing something like Wallison, and now he's improved that. So we can see that the man's name was actually Wilson, and if you recall, Wilson was the dentist. So they've gone into town, meaning St. Petersburg, to have dental work done. As you recall, Dimitri needed 12 or 13 fillings, and having now brought that up, I'm actually wondering if that could have been contributing to his headaches. So while Dimitri and whoever was with him were waiting for Maria's dental work to be finished, they went off to see this exhibition, and unfortunately he doesn't say what the exhibition was, so I really need to look that up and see if I can find out, just out of curiosity. And while they're there, they run into Olga Pistolkors' first husband, who has now divorced, or I shouldn't say he's divorced her, she's divorced him, they're divorced. So they run into him at the exhibition. He was a general. He was, I'm not sure how old he was at the time. She was 40. I think he was at least 10 years older than her. And he's at this exhibition. And then when they go outside, they run into his son, who's very young. He's only 20 years old, but he's already a horse guards officer. And these Pistolkors birds, as Dimitri calls them, well, it definitely wasn't their fault, especially the jilted husband. But what he doesn't say is if there was any kind of acknowledgement, if, there was a hello, a bow, a nod of the head, anything. So he recognizes them, but we don't know if there was any exchange whatsoever. I should add that Olga had at that time received the title Countess von Hohenfelsen, and that didn't come from Nicholas. That came from, I believe, the German Kaiser or something. It was a German title that she'd been given when she married Grand Duke Paul, but then later in 1915 she would receive a title from the Tsar of Princess Palais, and her children, Dimitri's step-siblings, would be Prince Palais and the two Princesses Palais. Okay, and that's spelled either P-A-L-E-Y like Paley or P-A-L-E-I, and she did write a volume of memoirs after the revolution, so that's definitely worth having a look at. Okay, so that's them. We'll leave them for the moment and go on to tea at the palace, and Dimitri's typical response to the four little girls is that they're very ill-behaved children. They're rude, they scream all the time, and he just doesn't like them at all at this point. And I finally looked up their ages. So Olga was 10, Tatiana was 8, Maria was 6, and Anastasia was 4. So really only Anastasia should have been still yelling and screaming, and the older girls had definitely outgrown that, if in fact they were included in it. Dimitri doesn't specify that it was only the little ones. And yeah, I mean, maybe there was a little jealousy on his part, who knows, but it may also have been that they were just poorly behaved children at that phase in their existence. Then he's a little worried that Maria Nikolaevna Laming is looking at me askance these days. So still some tension between him and the Lamings, although honestly he might simply have been imagining it. He was always worried, as you know, about whether people liked him at any given moment or whether he'd offended them in some way and they were mad at him. And he's going to bed at 9:45. I do not know, since he skipped that period between the 10th and the 15th, I don't know if Ella is still there. But the household seems to be, the children's household seems to be run at the moment as a kind of tight ship. He's going to bed earlier, and so maybe she was still there. I don't know. Hopefully we'll get caught up on that. So I guess I have not actually looked ahead, sorry about that, to see what the next diary entry is concerning, but I'm sure it will be wildly interesting, so come back for that. Bye.